Afternoon all. Round 6 has been very interesting today of the Gashimov Memorial. Mamedyarov playing white against Magnus Carlsen. So Magnus playing black. Let's take black's perspective actually. So Magnus had just lost 2 games in a row. He had been playing football yesterday. He wanted a positive experience. So could this help him recover from the 2 losses? How does a world champion handle 2 losses in a row with the black pieces playing against a very dangerous opponent? 2760 Mamedyarov. Magnus is 2881 though, a record FIDE rating historically as well. So d4 for Mamedyarov, and Magnus plays knight f6 after c4. No funny business, just e6. Very solid system, inviting the Nimzo-Indian system, named after Aaron Nimzovich, after knight c3. White could have played the Queen's Indian defense, but knight c3 inviting bishop b4. So now Mamedyarov chooses queen c2. I think this is Kasparov's favourite response. Also the e3 system, the Rubinstein system, is even more popular, but these are the 2 most popular responses. Now Magnus played d5, and white usually takes on d5 actually. This is a bit of a pain sometimes, this c pawn. If it's lost, is it a bit speculative? So the usual move here, over 1600 games in my live book, c takes d actually, or a3 to prompt the bishop to do something, but Mamedyarov plays knight f3. Now in this position usually black players do not take the pawn. The most usual response here is knight c6, just trying to put pressure on d4, making d takes a bit more with bite on d4 later, because there'll be pressure on d4. Also just castling is another move, but actually Magnus took up the gauntlet here. 21 games in live book for d takes c4, 95 for castling, and 124 just for knight c6. So d takes c4, very interesting, accepting this gambit pawn, and usually players with white will play e4. So a very interesting gambit here. For example, b5, a4, c6. This position, from an engine perspective, is actually, from Houdini's perspective, white's doing quite well here with some compensation. A lot of games have gone like this, and with e5 later. So there's a few games with e5 there. So that's an interesting gambit continuation. But in this game we see bishop g5, slightly rarer, pinning the knight. So b5 now, making it difficult for white to regain the pawn in the near future. This c pawn does seem like a real kind of gambit here. And white tried to undermine c4 with a4, and black protected this with c6. Still, white has compensation here for the pawn, and the engine suggests actually to leave the bishop on f1, not try and fianchetto it with e3. For example, e3 does stare at this structure. So say knight bd7, bishop e2. This sort of position should be okay for white. There's some compensation here. There's always pressure on the structure, a little bit more maybe than if the bishop was fianchettoed. So for example here, white could start targeting c6 and potentially get a little compensation, quite strong compensation. But in the game actually a fianchetto occurred, g3. So this is very interesting, quite rare, with out of book really after this. So Magnus plays bishop b7, and to be honest it reminds me of the many times I've gambited the c pawn playing against the Slav defense, because it's like a transposition to a Slav here, where usually I play for e4 e5 in blitz games, and one of the features of that sort of plan is usually to try and weaken black's king safety, to try and dislodge a knight. In this game, it looks kind of interesting. So now white is actually threatening to take on b5 and take again. So Magnus's queen b6 holds up b5. Now e4, as though e5 is on the cards, but also d5 is sometimes interesting as well. So e5 would weaken white a bit on the light squares, and d5 weaken white on the dark squares. There's a big choice there of of what square complex is going to be affected by this central pawn move. After a6, white actually looks to be preparing after rook fd1 d5, which would weaken white on the dart squares. So that's quite interesting here. Pardon me. Rook fd1, preparing as though d5 is on the cards, or just to keep the tension going for a bit longer. But now we see h6, and the bishop doesn't want to take here. That will weaken white potentially on the dart squares later. For a d5, that would be important. So the bishop retreats and makes d5 even more attractive, with tempo on the queen potentially. But Magnus is not too concerned about that. He's got a blocking move available. If ever d5, he can block. But this is very interesting, the mechanisms here. After castles, white does actually have an incredible resource here, which was pointed out after the game. If white wants to potentially draw, if white plays actually e5, king safety is affected with that knight being dislodged here, and this is something I'm carefully making a note of for my own blitz games as white here when I sacrifice the c-pawn. Very, very subtle. You've also got a loose piece here and the queen, which might be a target here, but it seems after knight d5 white can force a draw basically. I wonder if you can spot it. This is just a variation which could have occurred, was pointed out by Magnus Carlsen. What could white play in this position? Quite incredible actually. Absolutely incredible. Seems absurd at first. So can you see what white can play? If you want to pause the video and try and guess, just to try and, if white wanted the draw here, white can always force it. Okay, you won't believe this. Bishop takes, g takes, and I've just missed also by Mamedyarov, queen d2, because it looks as though just king g7. What's the big deal? The big deal happens to be this loose piece on b4, because after knight takes d5, hitting the queen and hitting the bishop. So black cannot take on d5 without queen takes b4. And if bishop takes d2 here, then knight takes, and this is going to be good for white potentially. After knight takes d2 here, if knight takes a4, then knight takes c4, and this is good for white. Incredible stuff, and something to bear in mind. White's heading for knight d6. That's quite a juicy square. This would be very pleasant for white, this sort of position. So an incredible resource to bear in mind with these breaks in the centre if you're sacking the c-pawn. Very instructive, I think, tactically. It just looks absurd. So it's an amazing resource. But white commits to weakening his own dart squares potentially with d5 instead. And it looks as though on the surface, well, d5 has got something going for it surely. Because on the theoretical surface of things, this blocking move c5, well, if it's not blocked, then I think white is almost doing okay after taking. There's a target on e6 here, maybe bishop h3, and this looks as though white's got some compensation potentially. But it's still a little bit suspect on the dart squares. If black starts marking out the dart squares, and they have been weakened with d5, black's going to end up, being in the driving seat potentially. But in the game, we see actually c5, which might actually be even stronger. These are double pawns, bear in mind though. But if white starts weakening his dart squares later, then it's interesting how black's going to get a grip on the dart squares. So we see a5 now, offering another pawn. So this is making the position crazy, surely. Can this pawn be taken? Well, if it's taken, d takes e6, and if f takes, then white actually might be doing okay in this position, believe it or not, with e5. So this is the point. So the knight's a bit loose here, so very limited options. Knight d5 to block the knight, and here white could actually be doing well, believe it or not, with this amazing resource again. Bishop takes h6. So if you want to play this pawn sack line, this bishop takes h6 resource is important to calculate, it seems. because here black's king is stripped bare because of that queen g6. You know, if taking, that would be terrible. White would actually be having a mating attack here, like this, like mating black basically. So this bishop takes h6 resource is very important here. Black would be best to ignore that by taking here, for example. And again, you know, it starts to get really quite dangerous for black. And this might be okay for white. This is a complicated position. What's going on here? Bishop takes, rook takes, check, knight g8, bishop takes b7. This is just an engine line, but it's scary what's going on because there's always knight e6 on the air. Apparently white will be doing okay. It's a crazy position, very crazy position indeed. But apparently white gets to be okay in this. Just to follow this craziness a little bit more. Yeah, it's actually evaluated as equal here. So this is just madness based on this pawn sacrifice. But Magnus sidesteps all this probably rather wisely. I think this is a great idea what Magnus does. He wants to be doing the sacrifices with the compensation. So taking this pawn sack does seem, you know, in an intuitive sense, if you can't see what's going on with taking an e5, this looks to be a good safety measure. Just to move the queen away. The engine suggests queen a7, but queen d8 is also very interesting. And apparently black is doing well. I mean, this keeps the tension for taking the pawn at some point in the future as well, potentially. Now white takes on e6. And you might think, well, what's the harm of this? It opens up the d file. It does, though, weaken e4. There's more of the glare of the bishop. This pawn is under greater scrutiny. And not only that, giving black this seemingly bad, ugly pawn has its perks, though. This rook can actually use the f7 square and maybe later come to the centre later like that. After knight h4, black is actually threatening immediately to take him and win e4. So this knight h4 defensive against e4, and black still now gives up the dark square bishop. So if white doesn't want to lose e4 here, white has to take with the b pawn. If queen takes c3, black does best to take with the bishop, or not even to take that. Queen e8 apparently is even technically better. I think just aiming for g5 without knight g6 and then taking on e4. This is technically the way to go here, and black should be doing okay, safeguarding this. Now e4 does seem very exposed. Any f3, there's always g5, and there's a big problem, big question mark with the e pawn here. So whatever happens here, knight g6, bishop takes e4. So basically, white should safeguard e4 to keep the supporters of e4 here. So b takes c3 was played, but now Magnus does play queen e8 in any case, so cutting against knight g6. So potentially now black is threatening technically g5 to kick the knight back and then snap e4. So white has to do something about that. So f4 is played. At least that stops g5, that forcing move. But e4 still can be problematic here. For the moment, it looks as though, you know, this is a bit of a murky position. And we see Magnus playing rook d8 now. So what is actually going on here? Well, with rook d8, maybe the queen can actually use f7, and black can start doing something, or rook f7 might still actually be on the cards of potentially trying to double rooks later. Also knight b8 to c6 if the queen was protecting e7 at some point. But at the moment, knight g6 is dangerous. So what does black want to do here after rook d8? Well, let's see, h3. So let's examine this. If the queen moves, actually this is a gross blunder, surely, because of knight g6. So that's one of the points, that knight h4 is dangerous. So you've got to keep control of the g6 square. But this other perk of f7 is used, rook f7. Now if black can play knight b8, then knight c6 and rook d7 is also going to be like useful potentially. but you've got to be wary about losing c5. The thing is, okay, white here plays rook d6, and with this it looks as though this looks very pleasant indeed, because you'd think anytime the knight moves c5 is going to drop. Magnus actually played e5, so locking down that target, that e4 pawn target, and perhaps white should consider here now not doubling or anything like as simple as that, just rook e1, just prophylaxis against e4 here. I think this would shield e4 from any potential problems. If black takes this, then white can comfortably just take here. Doesn't seem to be too many problems there. But white actually committed here to f5, and this kind of leaves this pawn backward really, with these two guys firing at it. Okay, the queen and bishop. At least g5 has been totally prevented, so the knight's not going back. But now this is a stunning move which bypasses, in my view, normal calculation. It seems, you know, one of the points here, surely, with white having the dark squared bishop and the pawn on c5, is that the knight shouldn't be able to move. But if you think in terms of positional sacrifices, then you can transcend material in your calculations as an endpoint, just make them the start point. And here, if you think about knight f8 as a positional pawn sacrifice, this is quite staggering, because Magnus actually played this positional pawn sacrifice, just offering c5. There's quite a few points to it which are amazing to consider here. One point is this kind of maneuver is also evident if the bishop wasn't controlling g5. Black could get at e4 later. Does white have to take? Well, his rook's attacked. So let's look at a few alternatives here. If white just takes on d8, then actually queen takes d8 is far better for black. After bishop takes, black can take control completely of the d file, and with that d file enter at d3 to put pressure on e4. This is a total backfire for white. And what can white do? Any attempt at disruption, even the king takes, will be okay here. Black still controls that d file. What does actually white do here? So this looks terrible after rook d3. That pawn is really being victimized here and actually blocked from any protection. And knight's silly on h4 right now. So that is not at all possible after this positional sacrifice. Just play rook takes d8. It just seems that would be a terrible idea. So let's rule that one out. You might think, well, double rooks? Surely, okay, if you double rooks, this now allows some very nice ideas from black. Maybe just taking is simple and good, and then rook d7. And if white now takes here, black again exerts pressure on the d file with a move like queen d8. This leaves black simply better. If takes, then queen takes might actually be equal here. Black's also eyeing a5, so actually a little finesse in this position. Knight takes here, protecting also against bishop b6, bishop b8, and again actually queen a8 now tortures e4. So white's got this e4 weakness as an echo in these variations, quite painful. Black would be better there. So there's another way of getting e4. Also, interestingly, fd7 instead of rook takes d6, rook fd7. This position is good for black. If bishop takes there, queen e7. This is amazing stuff, queen e7. So the bishop's actually a liability. And how does black actually, how does white actually stand this position? Rook d5, we can actually just snap this off, take on d1, and black is actually hugely better here, winning the queen. If king h2, then rook 8 d2, and again there's slaughter time actually. Look at this. So where's the queen going? The queen's actually been checkmated. So this is unbelievable stuff stemming from this positional pawn sacrifice. This position, White's busted. Look at this. The queen has actually been checkmated. It's got nowhere to go. So this is what I find staggering about this. It transcends calculation. This thing. So what else to consider apart from rook d1? If a rook retreat, let's go with a rook retreat. Then black just plays rook fd7. And after takes, we've got this story again, familiar story of blocking the e-pawn support. And black is again better. So it seems whatever way it's cut, White's actually getting worse off after taking this c5 pawn. I guess he's got an offside knight and basically a fundamentally weak pawn, which echo in the variation. So he took on c5. And Magnus took on d6. After bishop takes d6, he's controlling the d file. Rook d7. If this is protected now, it would be a disaster. Rook d1, just queen d8. And this pin is gigantic. You know, it can't be broken out of. If queen d2, we just play knight e8. So this is horrible after rook d7. If the bishop moves back, then we can either play rook d3, or we can even go like this for the e-pawn with knight h7. There's a variety of moves actually. Knight here to go here, or there's another good plan, just queen d8 with the idea of either rook d2, and that's pretty nasty, or even rook d3. But rook d2 might even be even more nasty. In conjunction with these ideas, this is just terribly weak. This e4 pawn. So okay, so White actually played bishop takes f8. Perhaps the engine actually suggests this is best. Bishop c5 here. Bishop c5, rook d3, and that's grim. Black's got all sorts of things. Well, Black's just winning this pawn, it seems, or winning this one. If rook e1, rook takes g3, that's grim. So White played bishop takes f8. This simple positional sacrifice seems to have emphasised Black's got a massive positional advantage now. So evidently White giving up the dark square bishop after weakening his dark squares, of course intuitively is a disastrous thing to occur, and Black's got this nice checking line resource now. The thing is, rook d3 is also threatened. So if White plays king h2, then simply rook d3 looks strong. But even just queen d8 controlling the d file for rook d2 looks strong. Or even queen c5. This is strong. Everything's quite strong here for queen e3. It's just terrible, the e pawn. So okay, so White played actually rook d1, and this is a disaster off the check. The king moves. Can you see what Magnus played in this position? If I give you 10 seconds, you might want to pause the video. Okay, Magnus played bishop takes e4, and White actually resigned. So he's attacking the queen. So what is going on here? Well, if bishop takes, Black's just hugely better. Rook takes, threatening all sorts of, well, queen g1 is mate, so queen takes, knight takes e4, threatening queen f2 and disaster on g3, etc. So here I think it's pointless for White to throw in the check. Doesn't do anything after king h7. White is busted here. Knight g2, shielding against the check. Black can do quite a lot of things here. Can even just take on c3. The check's pretty harmless. Most accurate is actually not king h7 but queen f8. We've got these connected passed pawns to start pushing. So queen b6, queen f6, or queen takes f5. It's just lost for White. So yeah, knight g2, just knight takes c3. So what does White do here? He is actually just lost queen f1. Let's try queen f1 with just queen e3, and now black can choose taking here. So how does white actually defend that? Knight f3, we can just take here, and these pawns are just huge. White's actually got nothing here going for him. Black's just going to march the pawns, start marching the pawns, knight e2, and then march the pawn, for example. So an amazing concept of sacrificing the pawn, a positional pawn sacrifice, transcends calculation. Just made the whole white position seem quite suspect here. After knight f8, white just seems to be really badly. Things are backfiring here, in particular the e4 pawn. So amazing positional sacrifice, I think. White missed his chance earlier with that e5 tactic just to go for the draw. So comments or questions on YouTube, and a fantastic comeback from Magnus Carlsen. Thanks very much.